There's a moment in every currency collapse when ordinary people realize the money they've trusted their entire lives is becoming worthless, and that moment doesn't announce itself with sirens or official declarations. It creeps up through small signals most people miss until it's too late. The grocery store that used to post prices on shelves now writes them on chalkboards they can change hourly. Your employer who paid monthly starts paying weekly, then daily. The neighbor who never locked his door installs bars on windows. Foreign currency dealers appear on street corners where banks used to operate. And the government that insisted everything was fine starts printing bills in denominations that require scientific notation to express. This is when currency turns to dust, the twilight period between functioning money and complete collapse, when society operates in a bizarre liminal space where the old money still technically exists, but increasingly can't perform money's basic functions. Understanding this transition, how it feels, what people do to survive it, and what permanent damage it inflicts, means recognizing that currency collapse isn't a single event but a process that can stretch across months or years of accelerating chaos. The dust doesn't settle quickly. It swirls for extended periods, destroying wealth and social trust while people struggle to adapt to an economy where money stops working but nothing has replaced it yet. This is the story of those transition periods, the practical reality of watching your currency disintegrate in your hands, and the adaptations humans make when the fundamental medium of exchange turns from rock-solid social infrastructure into worthless dust that can't buy bread or dignity or any path back to the stability that's been lost forever. The transition begins long before most people recognize it's happening. Governments always insist their currencies are sound even as warning signs multiply. In the early stages, inflation is officially moderate, perhaps 10 to 15% annually, high enough to notice but low enough that officials can claim it's temporary, caused by supply chain issues or external shocks or greedy businesses raising prices. People adjust by trying to spend money faster, by demanding wage increases, by converting some savings to goods or foreign currency if they're sophisticated enough. But daily life remains mostly functional. Money still works, just not as well as it used to. The shift from this uncomfortable but manageable situation to actual currency disintegration happens when psychological thresholds are crossed. One critical threshold is when people lose confidence that inflation will return to normal. As long as people believe high inflation is temporary, they modify behavior at the margins but maintain denominated in the currency. But when people conclude that inflation will continue accelerating, behavior changes fundamentally. They stop holding currency beyond immediate needs. They demand payment in foreign currency or goods. They refuse to extend credit or sign contracts denominated in local currency. And most critically, they start spending money as fast as they receive it because holding it means watching it lose value. This change in behavior, the collapse of money demand, is what turns problematic inflation into currency collapse. When everyone tries to get rid of money as quickly as possible, velocity of circulation increases dramatically. Money changes hands faster and faster as people rush to convert it to something real before it loses more value. This acceleration causes prices to rise even faster, which increases velocity further, creating a feedback loop that can accelerate exponentially. What was 20% annual inflation becomes 50%, then 100%, then 500%, then rates so high they lose meaning because prices change hourly and the concept of an annual rate becomes absurd. The practical experience of this acceleration is surreal. Workers in Weimar Germany at the peak were paid twice daily so they could buy goods at lunch before afternoon inflation made their morning wages worthless. Stores kept employees watching exchange rate tickers and would suspend sales to reprice everything when rates moved. People who received payment would literally run to stores because the difference between arriving in 5 minutes versus 20 minutes could mean the difference between affording goods or not. Money didn't just lose value, it burned away like paper held to a flame, forcing people to develop strategies for minimizing time holding it. The arithmetic becomes nightmarish. When inflation hits 50% monthly, prices double every month and a half. At 100% monthly, they double every month. At 500%, every week. At the peak of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, with prices doubling every 24 hours, anything you couldn't buy today would cost twice as much tomorrow, 4 times as much in 2 days, 8 times as much in 3 days. Planning beyond the immediate present became impossible. Retirement savings calculated in local currency became a sick joke, and any transaction spanning time, loans, contracts, employment agreements became unworkable because the value of money would change dramatically between agreement and completion. The social consequences of this temporal collapse are severe and often permanent. Humans organize their lives around the ability to plan across time. You work today because you'll be paid next week. You save for retirement decades away. You sign a 30-year mortgage trusting the currency will still exist. When currency collapse makes temporal planning impossible, social organization fractures. Why work if payment will be worthless by the time you receive it? Why save if savings evaporate overnight? Why honor contracts when the currency they're denominated in loses all meaning? The breakdown of temporal trust leads to breakdown of social trust more generally. In functioning economies, you trust strangers because money mediates the exchange. You'll serve a restaurant customer you don't know because their payment is worth something. You'll hire someone because you can pay them in currency they value. But when currency fails, exchanges must happen instantly with both parties immediately converting money to goods because holding it is loss. This creates enormous friction. Many transactions simply don't happen because the window for completing them before inflation destroys value is too short. Businesses respond to this environment in ways that look insane to outsiders but make perfect sense to those experiencing it. Stores demand payment in foreign currency, refuse to accept local currency at all, or price goods in foreign currency and convert to local currency at that moment's exchange rate. Employers pay salaries in goods, services, or company scrip rather than currency. Barter networks emerge as people trade goods directly rather than using money as intermediary. And the formal economy shrinks dramatically as businesses that can't operate without functional money simply close. The government's response to accelerating inflation typically makes everything worse. Price controls seem appealing. If inflation is causing high prices, just make high prices illegal. But they create shortages because producers won't sell goods at prices below production costs or below black market prices. Rationing follows price controls, creating queues and distribution systems that breed corruption. Capital controls prevent people from converting to foreign currency, trapping them in the dying currency. And increased enforcement, laws against speculation, against currency trading, against hoarding, criminalize the rational responses to currency collapse while doing nothing to address the underlying cause. Venezuela demonstrates this policy response perfectly. As inflation accelerated in the 2010s, the government imposed price controls on food, medicine, and other essentials. Producers responded by stopping production or selling to black market dealers who'd pay real prices. Shortages became severe, with people waiting in lines for hours to buy price-controlled goods if any were available. The government blamed businesses, speculators, and foreign interference rather than its own money printing. Capital controls prevented legal currency exchange, but black market currency dealers operated openly on streets because demand was overwhelming. And the government periodically announced currency redenominations, removing zeros from the bolivar and declaring the problem solved, while continuing the deficit spending and money printing that caused inflation. Each redenomination deserves special attention because it reveals the magical thinking that accompanies currency collapse. Authorities announced that the currency with too many zeros is being replaced with a new currency with fewer zeros, as if the number of digits is the problem rather than the continuous expansion of money supply. The old currency is exchangeable for new at some ratio, often 1,000 or 10,000 or even a million old for one new. For a brief moment, this makes arithmetic easier and gives the appearance that something has changed. But when the underlying fiscal policy doesn't change, when government continues spending more than it collects and financing deficits by printing money, inflation in the new currency accelerates just as it did in the old, and within months or years, the new currency has as many zeros as the old one did. Zimbabwe redenominated its currency 3 times. The original Zimbabwe dollar became the second dollar in 2006 at a rate of 1,000 to 1. The second dollar became the third dollar in 2008 at a rate of 10 billion to 1. And the third dollar was abandoned entirely in 2009 after reaching $100 trillion notes. Each redenomination was announced with promises of stability and reforms. Each failed because the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe continued financing government deficits by printing money. Venezuela has redenominated the bolivar 3 times since 2008, removing a total of 14 zeros, transforming what would have been a 100 trillion bolivar note under the original currency into a 10 bolivar note today. But the bolivar continues losing value because the underlying policy, monetary financing of government spending, continues. The psychology of redenomination is fascinating and depressing. People want to believe that authorities have a plan, that the new currency will be different, that stability has been restored. There's often a brief period after redenomination when inflation moderates as people give the new currency a chance. But this is temporary. When people realize the new currency is just the old currency with fewer zeros, that the same policies continue, confidence collapses again and inflation accelerates back to or beyond previous levels. Each failed redenomination makes the next one less credible and confidence more fragile. The development of parallel currencies is one of the most important adaptations during currency collapse. As local currency fails, people increasingly use alternatives. Foreign currency, particularly US dollars, becomes the medium for any significant transaction. Goods themselves become currency, with cigarettes, alcohol, fuel, or food serving as media of exchange, because they hold value better than official currency. Barter networks formalize into systems where goods and services are exchanged without money. And in some cases, local communities or businesses create their own scrip or tokens that circulate within limited networks as alternatives to worthless national currency. This dollarization process, the shift to using dollars or other foreign currency, happens gradually and then suddenly. At first, only major purchases like real estate or cars are priced in dollars, while daily transactions still use local currency. But as local currency deteriorates, the dollar threshold drops. Soon rent is demanded in dollars, then salaries, then even small purchases at corner stores. Eventually, local currency persists only for the smallest transactions, buying a single item at a street vendor, and even those are priced by converting from dollar prices at current exchange rates. Governments almost always resist dollarization because it represents loss of monetary sovereignty. If people use dollars, the government can't tax them through inflation, can't print money to finance spending, and loses seigniorage, the profit from creating currency. So governments make dollar transactions illegal, require businesses to accept local currency, raid businesses operating in dollars, and arrest people with foreign currency. But enforcement is impossible when the entire population is trying to escape the dying currency. The black market dollar economy grows larger than the official economy, operating semi-openly because everyone, including enforcement officials, uses dollars and understands local currency is worthless. The eventual endpoint of currency collapse is almost always formal or informal adoption of foreign currency. Zimbabwe officially adopted a basket of foreign currencies, including US dollars and South African rand, in 2009 after the Zimbabwe dollar became completely worthless. Ecuador adopted the US dollar in 2000 after the sucre collapsed. El Salvador dollarized in 2001. And many countries that haven't officially dollarized operate with dollars as the de facto currency for significant transactions while maintaining increasingly worthless local currency for small purchases and official purposes. This resolution through dollarization solves the immediate problem of currency worthlessness but creates new problems. The country loses monetary sovereignty, meaning it can't conduct monetary policy or adjust exchange rates to respond to economic conditions. It becomes dependent on US monetary policy, which is set for US economic conditions, not for the dollarized country. And critically, the government can no longer finance spending through money creation, forcing it to actually live within its means or borrow from legitimate sources at market rates. This fiscal discipline is economically healthy but politically painful because it requires either raising taxes or cutting spending, the hard choices that politicians avoided by printing money in the first place. The permanent damage inflicted by currency collapse extends far beyond the immediate economic losses. The middle class is destroyed, not just financially but psychologically. People who did everything right, worked hard, saved prudently, followed society's rules, watch their life savings become worthless through no fault of their own. This creates deep cynicism and distrust of institutions, of capitalism, of the entire social contract. Why work and save if government can destroy your wealth through monetary policy? Why believe in long-term planning if the future is radically uncertain? Why trust any institution that failed so catastrophically? This institutional distrust persists for generations. Countries that experienced hyperinflation developed deep sensitivity to inflation. Argentina's population, traumatized by repeated currency collapses, converts to dollars at the first sign of inflation and maintains dollar savings even when illegal. Germans remained intensely inflation-averse for decades after Weimar, with the Bundesbank maintaining the strictest anti-inflation policies of any central bank until the euro's creation. And individuals who lived through currency collapse never fully trust paper currency again, preferring gold, real estate, or foreign currency even when domestic currency seems stable. The political consequences can be even more lasting than the economic damage. Hyperinflation destroys support for democratic institutions that allowed or caused it. Weimar's hyperinflation contributed to the Nazis' rise by destroying middle-class support for democratic capitalism. Zimbabwe's currency collapse entrenched authoritarian rule as Mugabe used the crisis to consolidate power and blamed external enemies. Venezuela's Bolivar collapse coincided with complete breakdown of democratic institutions and mass emigration. Currency collapse rarely ends just in economic reform. It typically triggers political revolution, authoritarian crackdown, or state failure. The personal stories of those who lived through currency turning to dust reveal adaptations that would seem impossible to those who haven't experienced it. In Zimbabwe, during hyperinflation, workers would collect their pay and literally run to the nearest foreign currency dealer to convert worthless Zimbabwean dollars to US dollars or rand before the exchange rate deteriorated further. In Weimar, Germany, housewives would shop with wheelbarrows full of marks. Not because purchases were large, but because the currency needed to pay for simple groceries required wheelbarrows to transport. In Venezuela, people would wake early to stand in lines for hours hoping to buy price-controlled food, then buy whatever was available regardless of need because having goods was better than having bolivars. The stratification that emerges during currency collapse is brutal. Those with access to foreign currency through family abroad, foreign employment, or black market connections can survive and even prosper. Those trapped in local currency face impoverishment regardless of skills or education. A doctor or engineer paid in collapsing currency earns less in real terms than an unskilled worker who receives remittances in dollars. Social status inverts as currency collapse makes professional credentials worthless while connections to foreign currency become everything. The elderly on fixed pensions suffer most catastrophically. A pensioner who worked 40 years for retirement income receives a pension calculated in local currency that was adequate when granted but becomes worthless as currency. Collapses. They can't work to supplement income. They often lack family abroad who could send remittances. And they're last to adapt to black markets and alternative currencies because their entire lives were spent trusting official systems. Stories from every hyperinflation include elderly people starving because their pensions couldn't buy food, dying from lack of medicine because their income couldn't cover costs, and committing suicide rather than face poverty after lifetimes of work. Children who grow up during currency collapse internalize lessons that shape their entire lives. They learn that money is unreliable, that government promises are lies, that only hard assets and foreign currency matter. These lessons create populations that are difficult to govern through conventional monetary policy because they've learned not to trust currency. Argentina's repeated currency crises created generations of dollar savers who convert to dollars regardless of government policy. Lebanon's currency collapse in the 2020s traumatized a generation of young people who watched their life savings in Lebanese pounds become worthless. And Venezuela's collapse created millions of immigrants who will never trust paper currency again. The international community's response to currency collapse is typically too little, too late, and often counterproductive. International Monetary Fund programs offer loans conditional on austerity and reforms, but these programs often arrive after the crisis has already destroyed savings and created political instability that makes reform implementation impossible. Foreign aid helps at the margins but can't compensate for the loss of functional currency. And sanctions, often imposed for political reasons on governments that are causing hyperinflation through bad policy, worsen the suffering of ordinary people while doing little to change government behavior. The recovery from currency collapse is measured in decades, not years. Even after a new stable currency is established, either through dollarization or through genuine fiscal reform and central bank independence, the economic destruction remains. Banks that held local currency assets are insolvent. Insurance companies and pension funds that held reserves in local currency have no assets. Any business that held local currency receivables or assets is bankrupt. The financial system must be rebuilt essentially from scratch, a process that takes years and requires enormous capital. The credit system takes even longer to rebuild. After currency collapse, no one trusts long-term contracts denominated in local currency. Mortgages virtually disappear because borrowers and lenders both fear currency risk. Business loans are unavailable except at usurious rates or in foreign currency. And any economic activity that requires credit or long-term planning is severely constrained. Countries can remain credit constrained for decades after hyperinflation ends because trust takes far longer to rebuild than it took to destroy. The literature on hyperinflation often focuses on the economic mechanics and policy responses but underemphasizes the human experience of watching money turn to dust. The psychological trauma of seeing a lifetime savings become worthless. The humiliation of being unable to buy basic necessities despite having money. The rage at government officials who caused the crisis but suffered no consequences. The despair of realizing your country's currency is becoming dust and there's nothing you can do to stop it. These emotional and psychological costs are harder to measure than economic losses but are equally real and perhaps more lasting. The survivors of currency collapse share common traits. They recognized the warning signs early before it was socially acceptable to abandon local currency. They converted to hard assets, foreign currency, or goods before capital controls prevented it. They maintained flexibility, changing strategies as conditions evolved rather than rigidly adhering to plans made when currency still functioned. They networked extensively, building connections to foreign currency sources and barter networks. And often they left, emigrating before the crisis peaked and borders closed. Those who lost everything also share characteristics. They trusted official assurances that everything was fine. They believed their savings in local currency were safe. They followed rules even when those rules ensured their impoverishment. They lacked flexibility to adapt to changing conditions, and they stayed, either from choice or necessity, remaining in the collapsing system until it destroyed their wealth and security. The asymmetric consequences of currency collapse, where sophisticated insiders prosper while ordinary people are destroyed, fuel the political extremism that often follows. When government officials and their connected cronies convert to dollars early and buy hard assets at depressed prices while telling the public everything is fine. When speculators profit from currency decline while savers are destroyed, the resulting inequality and injustice creates rage that can persist for generations. This inequality isn't accidental. It's inherent to currency collapse because those closest to government and financial centers always have earliest warning and best access to escape routes. The question facing holders of any fiat currency is whether they're watching the early stages of currency turning to dust or whether their currency is genuinely stable. The distinction isn't always clear in real time. Every currency collapse looked manageable in its early stages. Officials always insist it's temporary, and people always want to believe their currency is different, that their government and central bank are competent, that collapse couldn't happen to them. The warning signs are similar across all currency collapses: growing government debt that can't be serviced from revenues, central bank purchases of government debt, direct monetization, real interest rates below zero indicating monetary conditions are too loose, accelerating inflation that authorities attribute to temporary factors rather than money printing, growing black market currency trading at rates diverging from official rates, capital flight as those with means move wealth abroad, and shortages of goods as producers and consumers lose confidence in currency. These signs don't guarantee imminent collapse. Governments can maintain unsustainable policies for years or even decades before collapse comes. But they indicate elevated risk that rational people should prepare for regardless of official assurances. The cost of preparing for currency collapse that doesn't happen is modest. Some wealth held in lower-yielding safe assets. The cost of not preparing for collapse that does happen is catastrophic. Complete loss of local currency savings and assets. When currencies turn to dust, they don't do so instantly or uniformly. There's an extended twilight period where money still technically exists, but increasingly can't function as money. This transition is where most people lose everything because they maintain trust in currency too long, convert to safety too late, or simply lack resources to escape before exits close. Understanding this transition, recognizing its signs, and acting before the collapse is obvious is what separates those who preserve wealth from those who watch helplessly as their money becomes dust. Worthless for exchange, worthless for storing value, worthless for planning, worthless for anything except perhaps starting fires or using as wallpaper in a bitter joke about what happens when governments forget that money must be scarce to be valuable and that unlimited printing always inevitably turns currency to dust. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History's dust pile is filled with currencies that promise stability, that were backed by governments, that people trusted completely until the day they didn't. The mark, the pengu, the dinar, the dollar, Zimbabwe, the bolivar, and dozens more all turned from functioning money to worthless dust through the same mechanism. Governments that couldn't control spending, central banks that monetized deficits, and populations that trusted too long and acted too late. Your currency isn't dust yet. It still buys things, still functions as money, still maintains the illusion of stability. But the printing presses are running, the debt is accelerating, and the warning signs are multiplying. The question isn't whether currency can turn to dust in modern developed nations. History proves it can and repeatedly has. The question is whether you'll recognize the transition while there's still time to escape, or whether you'll wake up one day to discover that the money you trusted has turned to dust in your hands. Worthless for anything except reminding you that paper currency backed by nothing but promises has always eventually failed, and that your currency, your savings, your carefully constructed financial security was never different, never special, never exempt from the laws that have governed money throughout human history. The dust is coming. It always is. And when it arrives, the only question that matters is whether you saw it coming and positioned yourself to survive, or whether you trusted, believed, waited, and lost everything to dust. You should have seen swirling in the wind years before it buried you.